In this episode, we'll speak with Robert Hanna about podcasting, and he's the founder and managing director of Kissoon, Carr, a legal recruitment firm and the host of the Legally Speaking podcast. So thank you for joining me today.
Absolute pleasure. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Rami.
Yeah, no worries. It's an honour to have you on. And just to get started, so our viewers can gain an insight into you as a person, can you tell me a little bit about your life before Kissoon, Carr and the Legally Speaking podcast?
Sure. So I very much come from a recruitment background. So I went to the University of Leeds. I did A-levels. I'm from the Midlands originally. I always wanted to sort of venture away from the Midlands. So I went up to Leeds and did a degree there. And then I always knew I wanted to go into the City of London. I didn't know quite what I was going to do in the City of London because I did a general management, business management focused degree at university, because at the time Leeds had a very strong employability rate with people doing that particular degree. And I fell into recruitment in 2008. What's quite interesting is that was at the time of the financial crash and the financial crisis. So I think one thing I tell a lot of people is I've had experience of starting my career in a crisis, and now it's slightly different with over sort of 10 years or so experience. I'm running businesses and doing things in a separate sort of crisis with all things going on, unfortunately, with the pandemic and COVID-19. But yeah, before Kissoon, Carr, so I fell into a FTSE 250 recruitment firm, and really from there I just took to it. So I then exited that business after a year and a half. I was headhunted to then go to join a boutique recruitment firm, and I helped scale that business and also kind of build out its international platform from a handful of people up to sort of 20, 30 people. And then I felt, it was time for me to do it for myself and set up my own business. So Kissoon, Carr was born in 2016, and my love and interest for the law comes very much from my grandfather, who ran his own successful law firm in the 1950s, where I'm from, Leicester, which used to be the second richest city in the UK back in that time, due to a lot of the commercial and hosiery trade that was available. And so I wanted to be connected to the legal sector because I hadn't historically done legal recruitment previously. I'd done procurement and oil and gas and energy. So I very much sort of span across different sectors, but I knew recruitment, and that was why I sort of wanted to get into the legal sector and do something different and disrupt the sector, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about now, hence why recruitment firms are now doing podcasts and all these other bits and pieces.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that you started off during economic challenges, and now there'll be a number of graduates who are just starting their careers during economic challenges. So it's interesting to see that there. But in terms of Kissoon, Carr as an organisation, you founded it in 2016. So could you tell me some of the work and the ambitions of the firm?
Yeah, so the work that we primarily do on the recruitment front is we service law firms. So we service international law firms, Magic Circle, Silver Circle, top US, White Shoe law firms, and as well as boutique and regional law firms. And that's across all the main legal practice areas. So anything from litigation, corporate, real estate, employment, the whole suite. So we're a full practice provider. And that's a large part of what we do across the UK, continental Europe, Middle East, and also Far East and internationally. The ambitions of the firm are very straightforward. We want to be known as a trusted, distinguished legal recruitment firm that does more than just legal recruitment. So I think for us, we're about building long-term, genuine relationships with both our law firm clients and our legal candidates. And we feel we have a duty of care to add more value on top of just our recruitment services and our advisory services. And that's why really we're sort of taking a vision of, we want to be kind of content and careers led. So we produce a lot of relevant legal content to educate and inspire and attract legal audiences to us, whilst focusing on still our legal careers servicing and advisory work. So it's very sort of unique in terms of there's not many people or many businesses in our field really sort of attacking the legal content as well as the careers side of thing. And that's why I'm really excited.
Yeah, again, it's good that you create legal content to help students and graduates navigate this quite tricky industry. But just to transition into the art of podcasting itself, podcasting provides benefits to yourself and to others. But what are those benefits that somebody can expect when engaging in this process?
Yeah, I think there's multiple benefits to getting involved with podcasting. So particularly if you're going to do a podcast setup like this today, where it's maybe a Q&A focused type podcast, because firstly, you learn so much from your guests that you have on. So for me, the Legally Speaking podcast, I've had the immense honor and privilege to have some of the world's most high profile legal professionals, entrepreneurs, Amazon best-selling authors, Olympians, you name it. So you get to learn. So selfishly, for actually having your own podcast, you get to learn a mass of knowledge. I think other things podcasting gives you is it enables you to enhance your personal brand. And as a result of enhancing your personal brand, more opportunities will come to you. So you'll get more speaking engagements. You'll get more opportunities to promote yourself and maybe your business or business ideas and what you're doing. I think the other thing podcasting gives you is reach. So there's a real chance. So the Legally Speaking podcast, for example, I'm proud to say that even from November last year, we're in the top 10% of podcasts worldwide. We're now in nearly 900 cities in over 85 countries. So just in terms of thinking of trying to get your message out to your target audiences, podcasting is still what I feel quite new, even though it's been around for years and years and years, and they're coming and more coming to the market. It's still a growing way of kind of advertising and promoting your businesses and services on a global scale. And it's community. The other thing bringing a podcast together is you're building a community of people that engage, listen, support, and you build up a wider network as a result of that. So, and the last point, I think in downtimes like this, is a bit of fun. You know, you've got to have a bit of fun with these podcasts as well. So it kind of injects a bit of fun into you. But there would be sort of 4 or 5 things I would say that podcasting has given to me.
Great, and those are really good benefits you provided there. I know you will have inspired a few people listening to start their own podcast. But in terms of the very beginning, so to have a podcast and to interview somebody, you have to actually have somebody to interview. So to have somebody to interview, you need to contact them by email or LinkedIn or any of those channels. So what should somebody include in their opening pitch to actually try to convince somebody to appear on their podcast in order to be successful?
So what I'm a big believer in business generally and in podcasting is actually working warm to start with. So I don't actually believe the best approach is necessarily cold approach to things. So when we did our first episode, I reached out to people that I had an ongoing relationship with already, that I'd already done events with. So we had 2 people. We had the current chair of the London Young Lawyers Group, a chap called 𝙨𝙤𝙀𝙧, who's a great friend of mine, and another friend of mine who was also the previous chair of the London Young Lawyers Group, Nicola Ruba, come onto the podcast, and we'd done events with them. We'd hosted a networking event through a collaboration at the Supreme Court, and so we built up a natural relationship, and they were kind of the similar mind that they wanted to kind of continue to add value through their legal audiences, on top of me trying to add value to the legal audiences. So I reached out to people that I already knew, but that were relevant to my target market. I think on top of that, as you build, obviously you want to get more people and perhaps people not known within your network. So I think the big thing to do is to make it really personalized and tailored and why you want that particular guest on your show. So we had the immense honor of hosting in what I think it was season 2, 𝙨𝙬 Rowbottom, who's probably one of the most high profile LinkedIn promoters, come onto the show, and we really kind of had to understand how we were going to create that pitch, how she would understand as someone who's creating video content on LinkedIn, and we're trying to explain that we're trying to educate the legal market and lawyers that actually it's a good thing to do, it's good for their business, and there's a nice synergy there. So we really researched how we could find a common synergy so it would be of a benefit to them, and why we're particularly interested in that guest, and wrote to them with real substance to show we've researched and really interested in them. And lo and behold, we get a positive response back. So I would say never cut corners in terms of your sort of research, and really empower and flatter people, because you're more likely to get a positive response.
Fantastic. And now you've got somebody who's willing to come on your podcast episode. What piece of software or application would you recommend for them to actually record the podcast episode?
So we pre-COVID, we would do all of our podcasting sort of in our offices, would invite people along. So we bought all of the kit, which again, you don't need to spend thousands and thousands of pounds on. There is lots of great kit out there. But equally, if you're just starting out, you know, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You know, things such as Zoom are just capably very, very good. So as long as you could do a bit of back-end editing on the files and you can get people to look at that or people to help you do that, then Zoom is just a very capable, easy way of conducting your podcast. Ideally, if you can get a sort of decent mic, a USB mic that you could plug into your PC, you know, the Snowballs are quite good, or you've got the Yeti type microphones again, which are quite good, which are not massively expensive. You can do it. I think a common misperception is I need to have masses and masses of kit and everything else available to you. That's not necessarily the case. So yeah, I think definitely kind of if you're just starting out and you're trying to connect with people, Zoom is perfectly fine.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. I think Zoom's great because it means that you can reach people all around the country and even around the world, particularly if you don't live in the city of London and you don't have access to people who you may want to interview. Zoom is great for that. And in terms of the actual content of the podcast, when you record your podcast episodes, do you have all your questions written down? Do you just do it off the top of your head, or do you incorporate a mix of the two?
So I personally am a big advocate for authentic podcasts. So I wish for our episodes to be fly on the wall, listen to. So what we don't do is we don't provide a script of questions to our guests beforehand. But what we do is we do a back end of research on our guests to make sure that we ask questions that we know they're going to know a lot of information around. So we have a sort of list of sample questions, but we don't do sort of question answer. We have a variation of topics and things that we want to cover, but we're a big believer in kind of going with the flow and ensuring that our episodes have a nice flow and the guests feel at ease and everything else like that. But yes, we do tons and tons of research to really bring out the best in the guest, and it's a benefit to you and them. The better you can bring out, the better quality questionings you can ask, the more you know about the guest, the more you know they've done. It's going to make your podcast stand out as a really high profile one. You're getting all these great guests doing these wonderful initiatives, and of course the overall content is going to be so much better.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you say that you like to do it sort of off the top with a little bit of research so that you can have like an active conversation. I tend to go more of, you know, have some questions and then have an active conversation through that, because I believe for me, it allows me to have more of a structure, especially when I have a specific topic I wanted to speak about. But obviously when you're doing podcasting, you know, it's creative. You can do it any way you like and any way that you think provides benefit to your audience. So I think it's great that you do like a different strategy than I do. But in any podcast episode, strong delivery is key to successful podcast. So between when you started the podcast in November last year until now, have you found any top tricks in terms of actually delivering the podcast in an entertaining way for the audience?
Yeah, I think we a good intro I think is really important to a podcast, and maybe you want to have a catchy jingle or an intro music or something that kind of people recognize, so when they hear it or they're at the start of the podcast we've done. I think the main thing we've tried to do with the overall podcast is just evolve. So what I mean by that is the main show has a nice structure and flow to it, but we're kind of breaking out now into more mini-sodes. So what we've done is kept the main show, which I host, but we're now doing a series of mini-sodes, which are bite-sized, 5 to 10 minute long conversations about a particular topic. So we've just launched on the Legally Speaking podcast an aspiring lawyers mini-sode series, where we've had 8 people who have secured training contracts talking about their particular journeys and how they've done that, because that's really targeted, detailed content. So we found mini-sodes as a great way to enhance our listener base and also give more regular content for sure. So that's one thing I would encourage people to look at once they've got a bit established, because once you build up a following on your podcast, you need to keep consistency. You've got to consistently make sure you're delivering.
Yeah, I think you raised an interesting topic there in terms of how long your podcast should actually be. So for somebody starting out, would you recommend a sort of longer podcast episode, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, etc., or a shorter episode like a mini-sode, as you just suggested, maybe 10, 15 minutes, or somewhere in between? What do you think most successful for somebody who's just starting out?
Back to your point again, I don't believe there's any necessarily right or wrong. It may be preferential, but I think somewhere probably in between. So when we first started, we wanted to cap our episodes at sort of 25 to 30 minutes. And the reason being, when we launched, is we were trying to target the commuters. So obviously people were doing a lot of commuting, particularly around the city of London. We thought sort of half an hour, you know, most people probably have slightly more than half an hour commute, but we really want to keep it within that time. Similarly, if you've got people who maybe want to listen to a podcast during a lunch break or during a gym session, you know, half an hour seems to be a good compact time where you can grab and captivate your audience. I mean, if you wanted longer, I would advise maybe making your fan base and loyal, build it up if you want to sort of go to an hour plus. But I think that's where, you know, you've got to make sure you've got really good content, quality guests, just because you may start losing people. And I definitely encourage sort of short, sharp, snappy mini-sodes as well.
Yeah, great. And again, you raise a good point, which is who your audience is. So in terms of actually starting out your podcast, what sort of preparation and planning do you think somebody should think about before they even record a video?
Yeah, make sure that their name's not been taken. I think we had to really think of a name that stood out, particularly now. The likelihood is whatever podcast you're doing, someone's already doing that podcast or doing a version of that. So you need to make sure that you have a quality name and kind of know what you're trying to do in terms of your branding and your positioning. So I think thinking about that first is really, really important. And then also thinking about who your target audience is and how you're best going to get that message across to your target audience. I think most people think, I'm gonna have a podcast, everyone in the world is gonna listen to it. That's not necessarily the right approach. You want to make sure that you've got a niche podcast where you've got a niche loyal following, because that's where you'll get people coming back week after week, wanting to hear your snippets, your insights, those words of wisdom, and they're more likely to then communicate and pass on that word of mouth within their industry, that it will naturally build, as well as all of your social media and various other campaigns that you're going to be running.
Yeah, and just to bring it back to the actual recording of an episode, you know, for somebody starting out, it may be quite nerve-wracking to speak to somebody they've never met before. How would you suggest that people actually dispel those nerves and to go into it with a bit of confidence and a bit of self-belief in terms of actual quality that they can produce?
Yeah, I think, look, preparation is important. So have a few sort of rehearsals, maybe in the mirror or with some people that you know or whatever. I always make sure I rehearse my introductions. So I think for me, a powerful start to a podcast gets people engaged and listened to. And then I think you just need to remove the mindset. Yes, you've got a great guest, but at the end of the day, you're just speaking to another person. It's a person-to-person chat. And that's why I think the authentic, fly-on-the-wall chat should hopefully, imagine you're almost speaking to them as if you're in the pub. You've met someone who's in the pub and you're just talking to them over two mics and you're having a bit of a chat. I think that's the best way. Don't think about all the great things they've done. Just think about, actually, this is just another person I'm having a simple conversation with, and I'm going to enjoy it. So the big thing I would say is make sure that you've rehearsed, done some few rehearsals, so you're comfortable with your introduction, you're comfortable with your opening questions, because once you've gone past that, I think you'll be fine. A great way to sort of ease yourself into it is maybe to have an icebreaker question. Don't jump straight into it. So we have and you may have heard about Suits. So we do an icebreaker question about Suits in terms of the play on its reality versus, you know, actual lawyering. And of course we have lawyers, legal people listening. Some people absolutely slate it. Some people say they like the Hollywood in it. But that just gentle icebreaker question puts me as a presenter at ease, as a host at ease, and puts the guest at ease as well, and just relaxes everyone. And then you can go into your show. So maybe chucking in an icebreaker question relevant to your audiences would help.
Yeah, and you've spoken about branding throughout this discussion. So when you've recorded and uploaded podcast episode and you want to promote it onto social media sites, which sort of software and applications do you use to actually design your graphics, to make some eye-catching graphics to actually bring in the guests to your podcast?
Yeah, so we do quite a few things. So we have, obviously you can use the likes of Canva, which is a great platform that's available. There's also Headliner, there's Wave, there's all these other sort of platforms which are good for putting micro snippets of content together if you wanted to do sort of a 60-second or 90-second clip. Because one thing that we do is we produce a waveform for every episode that we release, which is a transcribed and sort of videographic image of our guest talking through. So it gives 60 seconds as a snippet of the episodes, as a sort of teaser, if you like, and we use that to promote across all of our social media channels throughout. But yeah, so I definitely say those platforms are really, really helpful. In terms of just general hosting, it's each to their own with preference. I mean, we personally use Buzzsprout, people use Anchor, there's various others that you can use, but I think, yeah, again, Buzzsprout is a cost effective, and it also, for us, it's great in terms of looking at the analytics. So you can actually analyze your downloads, you can list your listeners, where they're channeling in from, you know, which episode's doing well, which one's not, and you can use and repurpose that content as well. So if you've had a guest on that suddenly your highest, most listened to, what a great way to re-engage with that prospect, to say, hey, you're now number one, feel free to shout about us, or whatever it would be. So you can actually use a lot of that data from the hosting platforms as well for sort of follow-up marketing campaigns.
Yeah, and I think it's good you mentioned Canva and Anchor, because those are two free sites that you can use. One for obviously Canva is good for designing graphics, and then Anchor is good for uploading podcast episodes. And of course, you have YouTube as well. So on top of Zoom to actually record the episodes, all of that you can get for free. So that really reduces the barrier to entry for anybody interested in podcasting. What would you say, for somebody who's interested in podcasting that you haven't covered already?
I would say if somebody says, I don't think you should start a podcast, do start a podcast. So, for example, I am a legal recruiter and now I own a legal recruitment business. Nobody believed that we should set up a legal podcast. Didn't see the value in it, didn't really understand why the business would do it. But I had a vision of thinking actually outside of the box. So if you've got an outside of the box idea that you think would be beneficial to you, your audiences, please go for it. Don't let negative or naysayer type people hold you back from, so for example, you might get someone saying, isn't everyone doing podcasts now? How the hell are you going to separate yourself? That'll probably be a common perception, or, oh, aren't they just being flooded now? Or what's the point? So you've got to be able to kind of remove away them, understand how you feel you can actually add value to people, and go for it. So my biggest sort of tip is get yourself out of your comfort zone and go for it. If you've got the idea, an idea just stays an idea unless you take the action. So take the action and crack on.
And I think that's a really good note to end this discussion on. But just in terms of anybody wanting to find you, Kissoon, Carr, or the Legally Speaking podcast, where can they find you?
Yeah, so my biggest platform I like to use is actually LinkedIn. So it's just Robert Hanna. You can find me, Kissoon, Carr, Legally Speaking Podcast on LinkedIn. We do have our own website, the Legally Speaking Podcast, which is just www.legallyspeakingpodcast.com. For our main webpage, Kissoon Carr, we have www.kissooncarr.com. But again, if you actually go into my LinkedIn page and go onto my profile, you will see we have the Scoop, which is a featured section, which is a GIF in my featured section on LinkedIn, where you can learn all about our podcast, our webinars, all our other platforms, everything else we're getting up to in terms of the legal community. I'm always happy to talk to people, always happy to help. So if you've got questions about the podcast or anything else, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to help.
Well, thank you for joining me. We've covered many areas of podcasting and some great advice you provided for anybody interested in podcasting for themselves. So again, thank you for joining me, and hopefully I'll speak to you soon.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure, Rami. Thanks so much for having me.